So welcome back. We just got to the point where I was making the case that a lot of management decision making is computational, right? So I have a few additional correspondences, the last few dot points on this slide, which I think will again hopefully trigger your thinking, right? So there is a new subdiscipline within computer science called human computation. I don't know if you have looked at it in greater detail, but there's a conference now, an annual conference, HComp, Human Computation, been going now for almost 5 or 6 years. Jabberwocky, which I'm making reference to here, is one of the earliest human programming languages. So it's very interesting. You might well ask, what is a human programming language? I mean, we understand and we all learn computer programming languages, but what is a human programming language? I mean, is it like a language which will treat you like a robot and will ask you to turn left, turn right, iterate the left-right routine 5 times until I equals 0? Is that what it is? It actually isn't. It's about managing crowdsourcing. So it's a very, very interesting new area, right, where we are trying to combine human smarts with machine smarts, right? So there's a very well-known database system, first crowdsourcing database system called Crowdb. Fundamentally, what it's saying is that, traditional database querying says, I write a relational query, I run it on a relational database, I'm looking for the address of a certain individual. If it's there in my relational database, it will come back and give me that address. Crowddb says that, well, maybe you have part of the address, or maybe you don't even have the address in the database. You have other stuff. You're looking up a student. You've got the student's name, ID number, age, but no address. Now, what Crowddb then does is it knows who to ask. So our traditional conception of databases is that the database query is answered by asking the database. But Crowddb says the database is now a much more generalized beast. It is not just the relational tables that I store on my disk system. It is also a bunch of expert humans, or indeed any human who might have an answer to offer. So Crowddb then asks the human. The right kind of question asked to the right human will give you the right answer. So it's a very interesting combination of query answering by looking up relational tables plus query answering by asking humans, and these kinds of answers are seamlessly integrated. So this is the sort of thing that's going on, right? So crowdsourcing. Now in crowdsourcing, there are headaches about how do you incentivize people to do the right thing, right? So why should people give you answers? A lot of the crowdsourcing that we do is based on altruism, right? Are you all familiar with CAPTCHA? CAPTCHA, right? CAPTCHA, right? You're all familiar with it. So you're signing up for a new email account, they will ask you to prove that you're a human being, right? So that's what they're doing, is they're putting you through a Turing test, right? So they'll give you a test which a human can solve and a machine can't. And by your solving it, then you prove that you're human. But there's also reCAPTCHA. How many of you have seen that? reCAPTCHA, right? So what you're doing in reCAPTCHA is your crowdsourcing. So the same guy that invented CAPTCHA also invented reCAPTCHA. So sometimes when you do this sort of signing up for a new account, you will see that they will give you a problem which is kind of like the old CAPTCHA style thing, some squiggly letters, and please tell me what those letters are. Then part 2 of that test will be they'll give you an image. It's a grainy image, you've seen this, right? So a grainy image of some kind of a number on top of a door, right? So it's like the street address of some house. And it's grainy enough that no good image understanding system can figure out what the number is. But as a human, we look at it and we say, yeah, that's 1209, that's the number, right? You know exactly what it is. So what are they doing? They are crowdsourcing. They need to, so for example, Google Maps needs to figure out what these house numbers are. And every time you're signing up for an account, you're helping them do it, right? So you're providing crowdsourcing input. They're also doing it for book digitization. So they'll give you a string of text written in some ancient Gothic script. And again, as humans, we can recognize what it's saying. Machines can't. Object character recognition, OCR, fails with those kinds of scripts, those kinds of fonts. So crowdsourcing, right? So we're doing it a lot. So human computation, human programming is in part about managing the crowdsourcing process. And you can write programs to help manage it. So I'll encourage you to look at it, but it's interesting because it tells us, again, that if I can view all human activity through a computational lens, that's very powerful. Because now I'm saying that all human activity is actually human computation, and some of it I can even position as executions of some human programming language program. That's kind of scary, right? So every day I'm executing a program written by who? I don't know. We were just discussing with Professor Kamath. Maybe that program was written by the divine being, but we don't know who, right? So we're executing somebody's program as human beings every day. But in a similar sense, you can think of social institutions as providing an operating system, right? So it's another correspondence between a computational concept and a social concept. So what does the operating system do? It helps you manage the complex operations of a system like a machine, right? Your desktop computer. Social institutions do exactly that for a much more complex beast, which is human society. Right? The judiciary, the legislative arm of the government, the law enforcement arms, and so on, they're doing precisely that. So it's a very interesting thing to say, okay, operating systems here, social institutions there. Now there's a growing literature on electronic institutions, where the idea is that we are saying that the sort of computer counterpart of a computational counterpart of a social institution is an electronic institution, which is essentially where you ensure that certain right behaviors and certain desired outcomes are achieved by collections of agents which are fundamentally autonomous. That's human society, right? When you look at a road, every car driver is an autonomous agent. Every car driver is doing his or her own thing. The only thing that keeps roads sane is the fact that we have a social institution in the form of traffic laws, right? Where we maintain our lanes, we don't cut into traffic, we stop at red lights and go at green lights and so on. Those are social institutions, and they ensure that collections of otherwise autonomous entities, when they behave together, they end up doing the right thing. But the critical thing is autonomy, right? So all of these entities, all of the agents in these social systems, they are truly autonomous in the sense that ultimately they do their own thing. If I'm going to get behind the driving wheel of my car, I'll do my own thing. I'll go where I want to go, stop when I want to stop, and so on and so forth. But I will do those things knowing full well that if my autonomous activity breaks certain laws, I'll be penalized. If I speed above a certain limit, some camera is going to catch me and then they're going to send me a fine. Right? So there's this idea of sanction, of punishment, right? And so the idea is that punishment, which is meted out because of violation of rules, is one really important device by which we ensure the correct behavior. And the funny thing is that we understand the notion of punishment in human societies. The same notion applies to artificial agent societies. So the same notion of punishment can be applied to ensure that autonomous agents do the right thing. Which is to say that, so that says that you will not always guarantee that they're giving you the right behavior, but if they do the wrong thing, they're actually paying a penalty. So it's very, very interesting. That's a whole new space, and in fact, you can't even begin to imagine how closely intertwined, things like jurisprudence, legal thinking, social science, sociology are with computer science. I mean, I've been in meetings where people have debated the exact meaning of a punishment, and it can be a very, very interesting debate in its own right. So, for example, in certain countries in the world, if a person is sentenced to death for murder, they allow the prospect that the murdered person's family can pardon the murderer. This happened in a certain country where a young man who killed somebody else in a fit of rage was about to be hanged when the other young man, his victim who got killed, that young man's mother came at the very last moment, literally before the hangman's noose was going to hit his neck. She pardoned him. She apparently, and there's a little, if you look it up on the web, she literally slapped the guy on the face, wept and said, okay, I'll let you live. Now interesting, so a legal system which says that I will allow this is saying many, many different things. So it's saying that at one level, punishment for a crime like murder is a social signal, right? You're literally highlighting, emphasizing in people's minds a rule which says, if you commit murder, then this will happen, right? But in these systems where you are also allowed, the family of the victim is allowed to pardon, there is an additional layer to the punishment. It is retribution. It is revenge, right? And that is the layer that is being highlighted when you're saying, okay, so we're also going to hang this person as an act of retribution, but if you choose not to take revenge, you can say, don't hang the person. So it's very interesting, right? The very act of meting on punishment has computational counterparts. So I'm maybe laboring the point too much, but the most interesting takeaway lesson here is that almost everything you see in society has computational counterparts, and we're beginning to scratch the surface of how we can leverage those computational counterparts. And so, if a bunch of serious computer scientists spend several hours debating this kind of death penalty, then you're saying, okay, something really interesting is brewing here in computer science, where we're going in places where computer scientists have not been before. Right? So now this brings us to services, right? So economic activity between humans and organizations. You can think of all of this economic activity as involving the provision or consumption of services, right? All economic activity is that. So if I buy a cup of tea from a chai wala down the road, there's a service being provided. The chai wala knows how to make tea. I wish to consume tea. A service is provided, a service is consumed. Right? So now a little bit about the history of service science. So service science is very closely tied with a bunch of companies, curiously, and with the growth of what economists call the services economy. Right? So in the last 2 decades, the services economy grew in importance. So certain large IT companies that used to be purveyors of computational hardware suddenly said, that's not our future. Our future is in providing services. And when they made that commitment that they're going to become services companies as opposed to, let's say, sellers of computer hardware, they also said, now that we're making this shift, we want the academic sort of underpinnings to support this shift, right? So we're going to become services companies, but nobody really knows how services are designed, how they are built, how they're consumed, how they are provisioned, and so on and so forth. We need the theoretical basis for this so we can better understand what we are doing. So thus came about service science. So one of the big players in this space was IBM, and one of the key promoters of the notion of service science was a man called Jim Sporer, who still is in IBM and who still is very actively involved in service science related activities. So fundamentally the observation was that the traditional economic model was what is often called the goods dominant logic. I buy a TV, I buy a fridge. If I'm a large open cast miner for iron ore in Goa, I'll buy a massive piece of equipment which is an excavator or a drag line or something that moves earth, right? I'll buy these things. Does iron ore mining still happen here? It does, right? Limited, okay. So I was just thinking about that when I was thinking about this example, that I'm sure there is iron ore mining in Goa. So that was the goods dominant logic. You buy things. You need a piece of equipment, you buy it. The new service dominant logic says you want a TV, you sign up for a service. A service provider will say, let's enter into a contract for the next 2 years. I will ensure that there is a TV in working order at all times in your living room of a certain specification. And if the TV goes wrong, I promise as part of my service level agreement that within, let's say, 24 hours, I will replace it with another functioning TV. So now I am no longer the consumer of a product, which is the TV. I am the consumer of a service, which is the provisioning of the TV. That's really compelling in mining. So now people are talking about servitized mining. So literally, the same open pit mine that might have in years past invested a massive amount of capital in buying a massive piece of mining equipment, these days the manufacturers of mining equipment are saying, don't buy from us. Sign up for the service where we provide the equipment to you and we keep it in working order. So you might be paying a premium, but you're not paying to buy it. You're not going to own it. The service provider owns it. The service provider. Exactly, leasing. That's right. That's right.
It's a service contract.
Correct. Airlines do it all the time, right? They lease aircraft.
So they don't own the aircraft, but they
Correct.
lease it from the company.
Correct. Exactly. So this is service dominant logic, right? So we're no longer in the business of buying goods, right? So this has happened and people said, okay, so because this shift is happening in any case, let's now try and understand it theoretically, conceptually, academically, from the perspective of all of these interesting things. So service science was intended to be this sort of multidisciplinary melding of multiple disciplinary inputs to understand the services phenomenon better. And so, of course, computing science was at the center of it all, clearly. But there was also operations research, marketing management, psychology, ethnography, all of these things. Right? So all of this happened, let's say this business started in the early 2000s. That's when a lot of large IT companies decided that they were going to become services companies, and we know many large Indian IT companies that did the same thing. And many of them had their origins in selling hardware. A lot of Indian IT companies also started selling hardware and then became services companies. A lot of Indian IT companies started out writing programs and still write programs, but maybe they package their programs better. Nowadays they offer different kinds of programming engagements. I know of a certain company that talked to me a lot about offering business analysis as a service. So business analysis as a service is a very interesting concept, and I'll tell you the story because it's very relevant and because it also highlights what's difficult in this space. So business analysis is the business of, building software models. For those of you doing software engineering, you start a software project by building your UML models and class diagrams and so on and so forth. Right? In other kinds of settings, you do process modeling, you do other kinds of conceptual modeling. So companies often employ armies of business analysts to do this stuff, right? So large companies employ large armies of business analysts to do this stuff. So this Indian IT company said, how about we start offering a service where we say, don't employ your own business analysts, we'll do it for you. When you need business analysis done, when you need UML modeling done, we'll do it for you. So that sounds nice, right? Because that's a clear value proposition to a company that's employing 50, 60 people just doing business analysis. They're saying, okay, we don't want to employ them, we'll just get the services done by this company. But there's one little problem there. And that is that if you are doing, say, software modeling for a software project, you might sometimes do bad modeling, right? And you must be learning about this in your software engineering classes. Bad software models lead to bad products, right? Bad software products. But can you look at a model and say, aha, this is a bad one? Can you look at a requirements model and say, that model is really bad? You can't. When do you find out? Pretty late in the story, when the wrong thing has been built and it's not meeting customers' requirements and so on. So that's when you say, aha, that was because I built the wrong requirements model. So there is this problem of, how do I quality assess the thing that's being given to me, the service that's being provided to me? There's no way of looking at the artifacts being delivered and saying, okay, this is a good quality one, or that's substandard, go and do it again. We can't do it, right? So this sits at the heart of a lot of service provisioning problems. How do you tell whether the service is of sufficiently good quality, right? You can only do things like go by reputation. Right? So, for example, you take a management consulting company. There's all these big ones, McKinsey and Boston Consulting Group and Accenture and so on and so forth. KPMG, all these guys. So when a management consultant from one of these big name places comes and says, give me a massive amount of money, I will write a report that tells you how to solve your management problem. And they write the report and you give them that large amount of money, how do you know whether they've given you anything of any value? You're holding a document, a report, right? The consultant's report. How do you know it's any value? The only way you know is by the implicit message these companies are giving you. They're saying, trust us, we are good. Right? Trust us because we've been in this business for 80 years. Trust us because we hire all our MBAs from Harvard Business School. For these reasons, whatever report we'll give you will be good quality. And we take it as an article of faith and pay them the money for the report, right? I wouldn't do that for my, I don't know, for any other service provider, right? If my chai wala gives me bad chai, I won't trust him. I will, smell the chai and throw it away and say, no, I'm not paying you for this. So what's happening here? I mean, so a lot of service delivery, the business of quality assessment, quality of service assessment is very, very difficult. It's one of the hardest problems in service science. How do you assess the quality of the...
Why the service is being signed?
Correct.
How do I assess the...
Whether this is the right thing that I'm paying for.
We go by the reputation and the historical data.
Exactly. And there's enough evidence out there that says that by reputation alone, there's no guarantee. I mean, it's probably a statement of probabilities. That's probably a higher probability you'll get a good thing than a bad thing, but that's all it's saying. You might still get a bad thing, right? So you trust. So what we're doing here now, what we're going to do in the next 6 days is look at the computational core of service science. So this is the focus of what I want to draw your attention to. So as I said, service science is interdisciplinary, but I am not a psychologist. I am not an ethnographer. I am an operations research person to a point and so on, but many of the other disciplines I mentioned, marketing and management, I am not, right? So I will focus on the computational aspects of it, but I will also, as I said, show and make claims that a lot of the problems in these other disciplines have computational counterparts and can be solved using computational techniques. So the one thing that is very obvious to all of you now is that we are using a particular social metaphor in a computational sense here, right? And that metaphor is the metaphor of outsourcing, right? The ancient human that said that, I can't do fishing and hunting and fruit picking at the same time, I will outsource the fruit picking to somebody else, was outsourcing, right? And we do outsourcing all the time. It's very funny because a few years back I was in a panel discussion, industry panel discussion in Sydney, where they were discussing outsourcing, and sitting at the back of the story was this whole challenge of outsourcing to India. So there was a reason why I was sitting on the panel. But there was also an Indian diplomat on the panel, and he pointed out, very smart young man, he pointed out, look, outsourcing is not new. We've done it forever. So don't act as if, this is this brand new thing happening and all of a sudden we are outsourcing to India. This has been done forever and ever and ever. It's nothing new at all. So I'll give you some examples of computational versions of the problems that we can solve. And I will say this, what gets me excited is two things. One is the fact that the computational techniques that we know how to use can in fact make a massive difference to very, very large, very, very hard business problems. And therefore, we should be spending time paying attention to these things. And later on, I'll talk a little bit about how the same techniques can also solve very hard medical problems, and that is also a source of inspiration. As I said, I work a lot with the medical community, and there's, there somehow the inspiration is even greater, because it's one thing to say I'll save a large company a lot of money. It's another thing to say that I will make sure that this patient gets the right treatment. Right? So it's a world of difference there. So I'll give you some examples of the kinds of problems we can solve using computational techniques. So one particular problem that I think is the billion rupee problem for the Indian IT industry is the problem of right-sizing service teams. So you take a large IT service provider in Bangalore, you walk through their facilities and you'll see some kind of a sign saying the name of a German bank up there. And there's about 30 kids sitting with laptops and headphones who are solving IT infrastructure maintenance management problems for the German bank in real time, right? So the problem solving takes the form of, problem tickets coming in. Somebody in Germany says, I forgot my password, can you reset it for me? And so this guy sitting in Bangalore resets the password. Somebody says this server went down, can you bring it up? The guy sitting in Bangalore brings it up, right? Somebody says our ATM network went down, so all hands on deck, everybody's on board trying to bring the ATM network back up again, right? So this is a very standard line of business. So when an IT services company signs up a customer like this bank to provide this remote IT infrastructure management service, there's a contract that says, We'll classify tickets according to severity categories, and for different severity categories, there are time bounds on how long you can take to solve it. So if it's something really small, like, please reset my password for me, we promise to do it in 30 minutes, right? Super easy. If the ATM network went down, then, maybe my promise is I'll bring it up in 24 hours, because you don't know how complex the problem is. So you have a contract, you have a team, right? And again, you can't, for various legal compliance reasons, you cannot put a person working for one bank on a project for another bank. So you've got to keep them within tight boundaries. So now you're a manager and you're sitting and saying, okay, so right now I have this service level agreement, this contract, and I have 30 people in my team. And I have some data that tells me what kind of frequency with which problem tickets come and how hard they are and so on and so forth. Now, is 30 the right number for me? Can I do it 29? Can I do it 28? Can I do it 25? Can I do it 20? Hard to tell, right? I'm sitting here and saying, okay, how do I tell? It's one of the hardest sort of business problems that has a computational solution. There's another version of this, right, which is much more macro in scale. All of our large IT companies, they have a significant proportion of their employees, as you'll all be familiar with the term, on the bench. Right? So what are they doing? They're building a buffer in supply chain terms. They're saying, I get one shot per year to recruit the graduating computer science classes from various universities. So I'll go and collect all these kids and I will train them and I'll park them. And when the projects come, I'll deploy them. But sometimes the projects aren't there, they're just sitting there on the bench. Right? Now, if you're a company with 200,000 employees and 40% is sometimes the number offered, right, of the size of the proportion of the workforce on the bench, that's 80,000 people not doing much for you, right? I mean, if you're an airline, that would be utterly unacceptable, right? If my fleet of aircraft are not doing much for, 40% of the time, I'm going to go bust in no time at all. But we do this, right? Because we are unable to predict demand. We don't know what projects will come. We're anticipating that we'll get some, and in case we get some, we have the people to do it, right? So we're parking them on the bench as a buffer. So versions of the same problem, right-sizing the team, right-sizing your entire workforce. Solutions, we must be guessing now, are actually computational. We said some of those things, right? Demand prediction. If I can reliably use data to predict demand, to say, okay, it is likely that I will get these kinds of projects over the course of the next 12 months, I know, right? Or if I know that this is the profile of problem tickets that will come from the German bank that I'm serving, I know how many people I should have around. I want to keep it lean, right? I don't want to have too many people. I want the leanest team that will allow me to service my contract without violating any of the SLAs. If you think about the scale of the problem, it is really the billion-rupee problem, right? I mean, if you solve this problem using the right computational tools, and I think the solution is staring at us. Nobody is selling it right now, but the solution is staring at us. You solved a massive problem. That's one example. The other thing is, and we had a flavor of this already, how do I provision my services? And by provisioning, I mean the allocation of resources to the execution of a service by learning from past data. So we've done some research on this in the last couple of years and written a bunch of papers on precisely that problem. And it's a really important one. Often the resources you're talking about are human resources. So you're often asking the question, I've got this contract to do, I've got this service to provide to my customer. Who amongst these 30 guys are the right people to pick for doing this job, right? If I have profiled my employees by looking at who was good at doing which kind of task, this person seems to be very good at bringing up servers that have gone down. This person seems to be very adept at fixing operating systems bugs. Or other things that you notice. This person is quite good if we ask this person to come in the middle of the night and do something. This other person, on the other hand, is really ineffective in the middle of the night. Daytime hours, she seems to work fine or something. You profile your employees and you use the profile to make optimal allocations of tasks to employees. It's a huge space. It's a huge space because it's a space where in the past we have relied on managerial insight. The expert manager sees the employees and knows what they're like and says, okay, I know the right person for this job. Now we can do this in a data-driven fashion. Again, this can be a massive game changer in business. Other problems that companies face, if you're a senior manager, you're saying, which things should I do in-house and which should I outsource, right? So one large Indian telco provider is often talked about in this context. They have some 100 million customers, but their staff is about 200. They do not employ any telecom engineers, they don't own any mobile phone towers, they don't own any IT, they don't own any computers, they don't own even the telecom billing software. Their 200 employees are mainly strategy and marketing. The rest is all outsourced. Right? So this is, in my mind, an example of extreme servitization. You package most of your enterprise functionality and say, okay, I'll package it as a service and I'll give it to an outsourced provider to execute. Right? Now, this is very powerful, right? Because this lines up with
How do you differentiate between outsourcing and importing?
Outsourcing and
Importing.
importing. Import. Tell me what you mean by importing. When I think importing, I'm thinking of a ship comes and carries a container from the city. What do you mean by importing?
Getting things from outside is importing. And outsourcing is importing.
So by outsourcing, what we're really saying is, it's the act of not doing some function in-house, but getting somebody outside your organization boundaries to do it. Offshore. Which is now offshore. There's another thing. Offshore. So, offshoring is simply outsourcing where you cross national boundaries. Was that what you were thinking about? So, offshoring.
Importing. People don't call it importing, right? When I get somebody's importing usually used for goods, but not for a human being.
The functionality delivered by the human being.
Yeah.
So there you don't think of it as import. That's not the term. It's something like outsourcing. Yeah. So saying I could either do it inside my organization or get somebody outside the organization. So does Goa University have its own in-house teammate? Does it, right? So, outside
we have all our cleaning services outsourced.
Also outsourced. Right? So it's the same thing. So, but which to keep in-house and which to outsource is a really, really interesting problem.
So people are now talking about complex service networks. And there's a very interesting study that I have always wanted to do. You can also model these very carefully using computational conceptual modeling techniques. Organization outsources to another organization, which further outsources to another organization. And then suddenly you find that this is, if you look at it graph theoretically, you have a cycle. Right? So that's very interesting because this can often underpin arguments, political arguments about whether we should issue more H-1B visas or not, right? So this analysis can be done using computation. That's a bit of a joke, but okay. One of the biggest challenges facing businesses is this idea of flexible service execution. So we will see this very shortly. So the next thing we'll look at is correct. So that's the theory, management theory that, for example, this Indian telecom provider is essentially using. They're saying our core competence is strategy and marketing. Our core competence is not the maintenance of mobile phone towers. Some other guy can do that. That makes perfect sense.
There is also danger when you outsource, you also lose that control. Not only that, you lose those skills. So now I think what Trump is facing is that the jobs are going out because they're losing those skills. I mean, those skills you consider are not important.
Yes, exactly.
But on the other hand, if we don't have the skills, then we can actually benefit without having to pay for building that skill set in our organization.
No, but also it is based on the differential of pay, right? I mean, if you make, then there is also a problem along with the. So if I outsource my cooking service over a period of time, I lose the skill of cooking.
Very true, very true. But there's also this, and I have this debate in my family, right? So there was a time when our living room needed to be painted. And I said to my wife, I will do it myself. Brave man that I was. I said, I will paint it myself. I made a shot at it, right? I botched it. It was awful. At which point my wife said, outsource. There are painters out there who know how to do it professionally. Why are you doing it? I mean, I could take a course in painting, in house painting, and then do it right, but is that the right thing for me in my own career, right? Maybe not. So in the end, we outsourced, right? So there are situations where, you might argue, so cooking, I think, is one of those skills where I'd like to keep it in-house, but house painting, outsourced, right? So there's a very interesting argument that goes again to the story of outsourcing, which is cloud computing, right? So cloud computation is again outsourced computation, right? You do not have any hardware nor software in-house. Even that is outsourced. Earlier people were saying hardware and software stays in-house, people are outsourced, but now even that is being outsourced. So there's a very interesting case study of a large Australian airline. So I often use this as an example to my students. I'll say, okay, take this airline. How many IT people do you think it employs? And it's a big airline, it has hundreds of flights every day. How many IT people do you think it employs? And they'll come up with numbers, various numbers, right? The correct number is 7. 7. With 7 people, they run the whole airline. So it is outsourcing in the extreme again, right? So the software, the hardware, a lot of the functionality, it's all outsourced. They can run the whole thing with 7 IT people inside the airline. If you look at most airports in the world, like I was passing through Sydney Airport a day and a half back. So I go to the Singapore Airlines counter and I'm checking in for my flight. And there's a lady wearing a Singapore Airlines jacket who is my check-in person. What a lot of people don't realize is that the same person who checked you in today wearing a Singapore Airlines jacket, tomorrow will be wearing a Thai Airways jacket and checking in somebody for the Thai Airways flight. So this is the one company that's providing all of this, right? So depending on which airline a person is going to work for on the given day, they give the person the right jacket and the person puts it on and there you are.
So the ATMs earlier were owned by the banks and the banks had, but now I think it's
the
outsourced.
Companies, yes.
It doesn't matter to whom the ATM belongs as long as you are able to withdraw money from
Correct. Which in some cases, for example in India where there is no penalty to be paid for using a ATM of a bank that is not your own, right?
Yeah, there is a penalty.
There is a penalty now?
I mean, after
Well, my snapshot is dated. Last time I checked, you can withdraw from any ATM. It's much the same.
withdraw, but I think if you withdraw more than 2 or 3 more than 3.
Okay, now you're telling me. Okay, I'd better worry about it now. So yeah, I was going to say that if there was no penalty, then the question comes up, why brand an ATM with your bank's brand? Because it's all the same, it's just an ATM, right? But yeah, penalty makes a difference.
Indicates is doing this. It's connected to all the banks and you can withdraw.
So generic ATM, and so no penalty. So everybody will go to that ATM then?
And what they're doing is they're selling also the ad spaces in the same ATM. So it's more of a service model for advertising also.
Right.
I can brand an ATM like my company is. That is possible.
Right. So there. So going back to the thing that we were just talking about. So flexible service execution, right, is the other big headache people face. So you take an insurance company, and I know of insurance companies that have done this study. So they say when I do insurance claims handling, I find that some claims are settled like lightning fast. Customer calls, we agree on the claim, it's settled, finished. Some of the claims drag on for months. There are complaints, escalations, etc. So the question is, why is it that some claims are processed efficiently and other claims are so complicated and cause so much misery? And of course, there is a data analytics angle to understanding why that is the case, and then I'll talk about that when we get to that. But that's interesting, right? So that says to us that a lot of the services that an organization offers, there's incredible variability in how it's offered. I mean, most traditional kind of thinking in software engineering and so on will say, okay, so an insurance claim handling process can have only two outcomes. One, the claim is accepted. Two, the claim is rejected. But in real life, an insurance claim is often going to end up in many, many other outcomes. For example, I do not accept your claim, but I will give you a small compensation payment anyway. That is not an acceptance of the claim. Or I accept your claim provided some conditions are met. I'll send an inspector who will check this and that and so on. So there is literally an infinite space of possible outcomes. An infinite space of possible outcomes, or even a large space of possible outcomes, means that I need to be able to design my services to handle that kind of flexibility. Now there is a very fundamental theoretical basis to this question. So if I think of service execution as the sort of iterative application of a bunch of rules. So think of the code that drives the Google car. There is a rule that says, I am stopped at a red light, the light turns green, the rule says now you press the accelerator or whatever the virtual version of that is, and you move forward, right? Now in AI, there is a problem that is well known called the qualification problem, which says that it is impossible to write the perfect rule. So this rule that I just talked about, you're at a red light, light turns green, you move forward, right? There are many, many exceptions to this. What if the light turns green, but there is an old person still slowly crossing the road in front of you? What if the light turns green and there is a car crash in front of you? What if the light turns green and something else happens? I can literally think of an infinite space of possible exceptions to the rule, which then says to me that I cannot write such a rule, because the act of writing it is, I mean, if in terms of length, it's infinite. Which then, you make pragmatic compromises. You say, I'll write the important exceptions and ignore the rest. Right? So that's what people do. But that says that, okay, so the qualification problem is saying that it is impossible to write a perfect rule. It is also saying it is impossible to draw or design the perfect service design for exactly the same reasons. Because the space of possible exceptions is infinitely large. So it is impossible to design the perfect insurance claim handling process because the number of possible exceptions to the insurance claim handling process is infinitely large. So we are facing the same problem, right? So now we have to devise ways in which we can solve this by allowing flexibility within certain pragmatic bounds. Right? So this is, again, a really, really interesting problem, a medical version of which I will tell you in a second. Oh, 3 has arrived. Let's have tea. Let's have tea. Yes, absolutely. I'm never one to say no to tea. So welcome back. There was a question I had overlooked from you. So now tell us the question.
There are various people over here, like from different fields and all. Of course, you are one of the brightest minds over here present. People talk about data mining and other exaggerating concepts over here. So being basically computer science students, for us and my friends over here, we overlooked everything what you all say. So we didn't understand anything. Most of the stuff. Data mining and all.
Your colleagues are sarcastic. No, I think, let me rephrase your question. So what you're saying is that there was a bunch of discussion in this lecture that involved data mining, and you're feeling somewhat insecure because you're saying I didn't take a class on data mining. So I've never read any books or papers or anything on data mining, so I'm not sure what's going on there, right? Is that a fair rephrasing of your question? Yeah. So let me put it this way, and this is kind of important for all of you. So it's been a while since I was in your situation, but I'm an old man now, but I still remember, right? So the one thing that I do remember is that when you're in your kind of situation, it's very easy for your brain to shut off. You say, okay, this looks unfamiliar territory, I'm switching off, right? And this is kind of what you're saying. I switched off because you're talking about stuff that I had not read about, nobody taught me. So number one, my general, this is a sage advice from an older person, is don't do that, right? Don't shut off because things look unfamiliar. Try and pick up what you can, that's one thing. But in this particular instance, the thing to remind yourself and for all of you is this. There is no prerequisite for this class, there is no assumed knowledge of data mining. We are going to make lots of passing references to data mining, lots of passing references to machine learning, deep learning, this, that, and the other. And one of the smartest things you can do as an intellectual is to be able to park things in black boxes and say, okay, I know the exterior of the black box, what's inside I don't care. Do that with data mining. So you say, okay, these guys are talking about data mining. As far as I know, it's this stuff where they take lots of data and learn some knowledge from it. That's all I need to know. Actually, that is really all that you need to know, because we are not going into data mining in any greater detail than that. And when you hear deep learning, neural networks, machine learning, all you're saying is that there are different variations of the same black box. That's what these black boxes do. So keep that picture in mind and you will not be afraid. Right? Does that help? Okay. So I'm going to only keep you here for another 20 minutes because I know that there's this thing called the human attention span, and it can only be pushed so far and no further. So after 20 minutes, you will all go away. You'll enjoy a weekend, and then I will see you all on Monday afternoon. You'll be all bright and eager and ready with lots of questions, right? Okay, so what I want to do, so I'm sort of still wrapping up my introduction to computational service science. And as I said, there is a very ambitious agenda in the Gyan course poster, and I had a very initial ambitious agenda, but I am of the opinion that I wouldn't care less if we didn't finish every last thing on that list. As long as I have lit the fires, as long as I have a group of people who feel inspired, who are saying, okay, this is really interesting, maybe I want to consider doing a PhD here with Professor Kamath or with Professor Bhaskar or all the other good academics you have here, and I maybe want to look at these kinds of questions, then we've achieved our objective, right? Because you are now interested, you're saying, okay, this kind of stuff really will make a difference. So that's my objective, and if I achieve that in 6-7 lectures, I'm really happy, right? So the extent of technical detail I can give you, I mean, the more the merrier, but if I don't give you all of it, I'm not going to lose sleep. So I said, the one thing that inspires us to do this stuff is the fact that it's of enormous business consequence, right? So these are the billion rupee problems. But there is another thing that inspires me, and that is the medical implications of this stuff. And so I put up a little picture of a Time magazine cover issue from September 2015, where they were asking, can Google beat death? And some of the arguments put forward was that with, again, data mining, data analytics and so on, maybe we can. And in some sense, a lot of the projects I'm engaged in the medical space, as I mentioned, there's quite a bit, are in that spirit. But there's some very interesting lessons to keep in mind, and when I tell you these stories now, later in the next few lectures, you'll be able to connect them to what I'm talking about now. So let's look at medicine and how medical knowledge is acquired. So it's a very funny story, and most of us in computer science tend not to think about these kinds of questions, but there is a knowledge acquisition process in medicine, right? And that process, I mean, there's parts of the process which we will not talk about, which is the standard scientific processes, lab experiments, things of that sort. But in medicine, in clinical knowledge, there is this one process that is universally followed, and indeed it is followed so rigorously and with such almost authoritarian enforcement that people cannot dare deviate from it. And that is the process of an RCT. An RCT is a randomized controlled trial, also sometimes called a randomized clinical trial, where a doctor, a clinical person, a medical scientist is basically trying to find empirical evidence to support a hypothesis. So suppose your hypothesis is that for a certain disease, treatment X plus Y gives better outcomes than just doing treatment X. So I'll give you an example of one that I saw recently being done by the colleagues I work with. So for patients with lung cancer, doing radiation therapy on the lung coupled with anticipatory radiation therapy on the brain works better than just doing radiation therapy on the lung. And by anticipatory, I mean, so this lung cancer patient might not have had metastasis to the brain, but typically it does go from the lung to the brain. So they're saying, before we find evidence of it, let's zap the brain with radiation just to kill off any cells that might have already shown up that we don't know they are. So anyway, so this is an example of a hypothesis. So traditional medicine had it that we just do radiotherapy on the lung. This new model says radiotherapy on the lung plus radiotherapy on the brain. So does this work better? So you design an RCT, a clinical trial. A clinical trial takes about, many times, about 10 years from inception to completion. 10 years. 10 years to obtain one little nugget of knowledge that X plus Y is better than just X, right, as a treatment. 10 years. Now what the actual trial does is the following thing. As patients come in, they are assessed against qualifying eligibility criteria. And that is a very interesting exercise in its own right. They basically want to factor out all externalities. So they don't want the very old, the very young, people who have other diseases, other kinds of complications. So they want the clean cases, right? So no other externalities that might influence the outcome. So if a patient meets these criteria, and so mind you now, we're talking about only patients who are otherwise healthy, who are not very old, not very young, don't have other dramas, medical dramas in their lives. These are the patients we put on the trial. Then there is a randomizing engine which says randomly the patient will be put on one arm or the other arm of the trial. The one arm is where the patient only gets treatment X, the other arm the patient gets X plus Y. We track them over several years and then we see how it went for them. Remember we're talking, let's say in the case of lung cancer, it actually takes several years before you know if you're, so the measure of success, a quality of service measure is 5-year survival or 3-year survival, things of that sort. And when this whole process is done and the results are collated, the statistics are done, then you have a nugget of knowledge that says, okay, so I know, chances are X plus Y is better than X. Now, it's very interesting. So, medical scientists also have to follow very strict ethical guidelines, more so than computer scientists, although I would like to see computer scientists being put to the same kind of rigorous test. So, ethics has it that, your Hippocratic oath as a doctor says that I will never willingly treat a patient with less than the best treatment available. Now, think about it. When you're putting a patient randomly on arm X versus arm X plus Y, are you not violating that ethical principle? So technically speaking, you're not. Technically speaking, yeah, but technically speaking, you see, you're supposed to be perfectly uncertain about the relative efficacy of this arm versus that arm. I truly have no prior knowledge to tell me that one is better than the other. Therefore, I'm testing it. But think about why you designed this trial. Because you have a hunch that X plus Y is better than X. So despite the fact that you have a hunch and therefore enough evidence already to say that this one is better than that one, you're still knowingly putting some patients on the lesser arm, right, where they're getting a less than perfect treatment. So there's an ethical question. Let's set that aside. So maybe we can live with it. Maybe not. I mean, I certainly never want me or any of my relatives to be on the lesser arm, right? I would rather be on the better arm. But it's a randomizing engine that will put me there. Now this knowledge gets distilled into, and now we are coming to the technical detail of what we will talk about in this lecture, in this course. It's distilled into a clinical process design, a clinical service design. So there is a process design for each disease. These are called clinical guidelines. So a guideline is a body of text that literally describes a process. It says, if you have a patient with this disease, first you do this, then you do that, and so on. So it's a stepwise treatment procedure, a recipe, right? And you can look at, there's lots of repositories of clinical guidelines on the web. There's, for example, the US National Institutes of Health repository is called guidelines.gov. So look it up. There's lots of these textual clinical process descriptions. They have about 18,000 such. So there is an ontology of diseases which has 18,000 categories. We know of 18,000 different pathologies. And for each I have a process description that says you have to do this for this disease. Now here it gets very interesting. Now, doctors are obliged, sometimes legally obliged, to follow the guidelines. So I was just looking at a TV interview with a doctor three nights back, who was arguing with somebody who was trying some kind of non-traditional therapy, and the doctor said, look, I have to confess, if I tried that stuff with you, I'd be in legal trouble. They'd take away my insurance cover. I am legally obliged to follow the guideline, right? Which says to us that, okay, so these guidelines are like carved in stone. You have to follow it. So you now think about how you got the guideline. You got the guideline by doing these clinical trials, which are based on people who are not too old, not too young, don't have other diseases and so on. But the real patients that you see, and I have had any number of radiation oncologists complain bitterly about this to me. They're saying they did the trials and they got the guideline based on this very clean set of patients, but my real patients are not those clean set. They are the old, they are the young, they are the ones who have other diseases going on. But I am now legally obliged to follow the findings from these trials on these guys. Now, we know statistically we are doing the wrong thing. We learn a rule from one cohort and apply it to an entirely different cohort. We shouldn't be doing it, and yet we are. So recently, there were cases where certain clinical specialists were literally given, taken to court and dismissed and so on because they failed to follow guidelines. When, in fact, they're saying and complaining bitterly, they're saying, we were treating a very old person. This was chemotherapy. And it stands to reason as a medical professional, I know that if I give the guideline dose of chemotherapy to this person, the person can't take it. It's terrible stuff. So I knowingly reduced the dose because I was doing the right thing. But it wasn't the guideline. So they were in trouble. So we're living in this very funny age where our clinical process designs are carved in stone. They force people to work in a certain way. And how you get these clinical processes, the designs of these processes, is highly questionable. So this leads to all kinds of issues. So for example, a related issue that I have been dealing with not much success is the following. So I'll talk to you guys in a couple of lectures' time about process analytics, which is learning about service or process designs from past execution data. And again, we're not going to use data mining, we're just going to use these techniques as black boxes. So don't go and hit a machine learning textbook tonight and start, you don't have to, right? So, so I want to do process analytics to understand from clinical process execution histories what process instances worked well and what didn't and what's common to them therefore. So for me to do this, there must be variability in the data. Any kind of machine learning relies on variability. If all the data I'm looking at is generated by one formula, suppose the data is, two variables x and y, and all the data I'm looking at is generated by a formula which says x equals 2 times y. What's the point of doing machine learning? I already know the knowledge that generated the data is x equals 2 times y. There's nothing to learn. But that is the nature of the data I'm facing. I go to an oncologist and say, can I get your process data? They'll say, well, you won't get much interesting because we're all following the guideline. Now that then says, where will we get our innovations from? How will clinical processes get better? Because everybody across the world now are following the same guidelines over and over again. Nobody's deviating. And if you're not deviating, you're not looking for opportunities to do better treatment. It's a really bizarre situation, right? On the flip side, we have some good results. So I'll give you a link to a website which you can play with. So we've done so this network that I work with, the network has generated enough data to do some data mining on the data to find essentially predictive models that say if a patient has these kinds of features, this is the likelihood of survival. And this forms the basis nowadays for a lot of hospitals in Sydney, where they're using data mined from a network, including a range of hospitals in Europe, to say, they have this conversation with patients to say, with your situation, it looks like if we do this aggressive radiotherapy or chemotherapy, there's a chance that you'll live. So let's do it. Let's go through the pain of doing it. For some other patients, the conversation is, look, the data says it's not looking very good for you. So you can make your last few days comfortable. We can do palliative care, but we won't do aggressive care. So this is happening based on quick and dirty data mining on clinical data, and that's kind of rewarding. But there are limits, and these limits are the ones I talked about. So this is about the design of clinical services, about clinical processes. There's also other dimensions to it, which is about efficient delivery of clinical processes, which is a big headache everywhere in the world. I know that there are many, many medical systems where people are dying because they can't schedule, life, in life-threatening situations, surgery at the right time because the system is so clogged. Right? And yet there are systems where some hospitals are overloaded and other hospitals are kind of underloaded, and nobody's trying to do load balancing. And so there's lots of interesting stuff that can be done in that clinical service design space as well. And that's very rewarding work. So off and on I will talk about these aspects of it. So this is just to flag that there is a very interesting additional dimension. We are not just in the business of making lots of money for big companies. There's other ways in which this work is also interesting.
So what about the education? See, in education also we need the same kind of in a classroom of 60 or 50, whatever. See, I'm treating them with the same sort of instructions, right? So
we're not fine-grained, looking at them in a fine-grained way. That is very true. In fact, so there is even older literature on intelligent ITS, intelligent learning systems, where the idea is that the online delivery of educational content is tailored based on what I learned from the interaction. Yeah, those kinds of things. That's been around for a while. A lot more can be done. I mean, I think the MOOCs that are around, the Coursera type things, they're already sort of doing some of that. They will tailor the content to the extent that you have displayed in your interaction. Whether that is adequate or not, we don't know. So very funny things going on. So, for example, one large IT company with a very famous big name learning system, which I will not name, is now going to mark the essays. So in Australia, year 3, year 5, year 7, year 9, they have this standardized national test. So most of it is computer graded, but the writing is used to be human graded. I think from next year that's going to be graded by this system. That raises interesting questions. Right? So are we all going to encourage people to write the same kind of essay therefore? At least earlier we had a diversity of examiners. You were kind of rolling your dice, right? If you're an examiner for your English composition paper, like your style of writing, you got it better mark. That was how it was when I was young. Sometimes you struck it lucky. But now it will be like this, there's the one examiner for everybody. It's been trained on many tens of thousands of previous essays. Training data will be, these essays are good essays. So these essays deserve a 80 to 90 mark, these essays deserve a 70 to 80 mark and so on. So this is the training data set. Now it internalizes the model, next time it gets an essay, it uses it for that. It's a funny mover, it's deeply unsettling. What that will be.
but practical. But practical. In a sense,
I mean that for an administrator is practical.
from the point of view of
You tend to kill the art in the whole thing.
yeah, but see,
Diversity, because administration versus diversity is
I
always.
mean, imagine a deep learning based art critic, or a theatre critic, or a movie critic. Deep learning, I train it on all Hollywood movies forever, right? And I say this one is a 5-star, this is a 4-star, this is a 3-star. I show a new movie. So tell me, what is the star rating for this one? I don't know if it will work. It is deeply unsettling. What do you think?
yeah, sure.
This is a data scientist conceding that yes, sure, maybe it is unsettling.
So
Basically, because innovation is basically outside, and outside in the sense like
Outside the scope of what we can do with data science. Exactly, you're right. Yes.
another thing, when you mentioned about clinical processes, right? There are a few 6-7 months back, Dr. Manish Parashar from Rutgers University, he came to Goa College of Engineering, and he advised me to read this book called Data Science: The Fourth Paradigm. So, data being the fourth paradigm in science. So, in that book, one of the chapters it suggests of a medical singularity when whatever research is being done is an algorithm itself. So every time a research is accepted, what it spoke was any new research that is there, from that point to it becoming a guideline, there is a gap in it. So, for example, they gave us scurvy. Like from the time the thing of scurvy was discovered to the time it was implemented, there was almost 157 years. And it says today that gap is around 17 years. So they are talking
no, it's faster still. It's faster still. In fact, I know of various medical bodies in Australia. They're called Royal College of this and that, right? So Royal College of Radiation Oncologists, or Royal College of Internal Medicine, and so on. So these guys, they have specialized committees. So the sage-wise people in that medical specialty, they sit together in a committee and say, this is again a part where there is very unpredictable human availability. So we have the clinical trial results sitting here, and we have the wise old doctors sitting here, and looking at that data and saying, okay, people, what should the guideline be? And they then come into the guideline. So there is not just the data, it's not purely empirical, there is some amount of human experience being brought to play, but they are obliged to follow the data. I mean, they cannot ignore what the data say.
What this book was talking about was a medical singularity in which the minute a thing becomes accepted should be a part of a guideline. So,
after accepting something should be part of the guideline, okay?
So, what are your views on that? Because it is usually when that gap is there are a lot of tests that are created on it before it becomes a guideline, right? Like making
No, so that's what I'm saying. So the process is literally that you have the evidence base which comes from the clinical trials, and then you have the committees. Committees plus evidence base equals guideline. And the committees are obliged to not ignore the evidence base. They have to follow.
But then can this entire process be converted into an algorithm that a computer manages by itself?
So at a sort of low level, that's actually been done. I read a few papers where they're talking about intelligent automation of the clinical trial management process and so on. That stuff can be done.
Medical science is very statistical nature. Not even an algorithmic way of doing it stuff over here. Each cell works very differently within cells. And
that's another very interesting thing. Right? So can I build a deterministic model of a human cell and therefore the human body? Who knows? There are attempts underway. So there is a thing called the foundational model of anatomy, which is a ontology for anatomical features. And you can literally say, you can refer to even small groups of cells and tissue by an identifier from the ontology and so on. So you can do all kinds of good stuff. And people are trying to build, to varying degrees of success, simulators. Okay, so the problem, and this brings us to the other thing that I had in my previous slide. The simulator is supposed to, in the ideal case, it encodes the latest and best in medical knowledge. Right? So I put that in the simulator. All those behaviors are now encoded. Now I can sort of ask questions like, if I give the cell this kind of chemical, how would it work? So that's what is in principle going on. But think about this. PubMed, which is this online repository, look it up, right? So many millions of biomedical and medical papers, abstracts. It's growing at the rate of several thousand abstracts per week. 4, 5, 6, 7,000 abstracts, depending on which week you're looking at. It's growing at that rate. So one of the first things, never mind discourse, never mind, as human beings, first thing that I would worry about is, I'm going to go to see a doctor tomorrow. Is my doctor's knowledge current? Has my doctor read the 7,000 abstracts that came out in the last 7 days? Can my doctor read those 7,000 abstracts that came out in the last 7 days? They cannot. So there are solutions that people are talking about. Mine in real time, text mine these abstracts and give decision support advice to doctors saying, okay, for this patient, this is what the literature is saying that we do right now. That has problems as well. Doctors are often not familiar with the newfangled stuff that's going on. The literature says perform this procedure. Doctors saying, never done it in my life. You want me to do it for this patient? How? So it's very, very weird. The pace of medical knowledge is growing at it's growing at a speed that we cannot keep up with, and the human execution of clinical processes therefore always will lag behind and by probably decades. So we know as a fact that the next time you're seeing a doctor, the body of knowledge your doctor is going to bear to treat you is probably some decades old. That's a given, there's no two ways about it. Some doctors in some super specialties in some cases, they might have very, very current knowledge, but for the most part, you're being treated with really old knowledge. I think that's not a bad thing. Older knowledge is better knowledge.
There is an interesting article about bad science where they say that many, nearly about 25% to 40% of the studies in neuroscience or psychology, these kind of sciences, they are not reproducible. And also we have this hypothesis testing being questioned, like whether we can actually take p-values.
You're very right. In fact, this is something I've been talking about with colleagues just in the last several weeks. Kick off this discussion. Right? So, the good thing about biomedical research is that there is at least some minimal attempt at trying to reproduce results. Right? You will take somebody's data set and then say, okay, I'll run the experiments again, let me see it. Not something you're playing with it. And now you see in the news every other day in a lot of academic systems where there is a pressure to publish or perish, people are fudging their data. Badly fudged and it's scandal after scandal. What is worse for computer science is that we also do this stuff. Right? We also run experiments, report our results, draw graphs.
Sorry to interrupt you, maybe the audience didn't understand the context like, about what I said.
Okay.
Just explain in simple words so that they can understand. Because this is an interesting this concept.
So let me see. I'm going to go back the process to where your question came. The question was, remind me of your question again?
No, I just
lost the train of thought.
I just said that the studies in neuroscience or psychology, these 25 to 40% are not reproducible.
Yes.
And also that
so a lot of biomedical research is they report experimental results that are not reproducible, and I was saying that is in fact true, and that's a dangerous thing. But what is worse, what I was going to come to, is that in computer science, nobody even tries to reproduce it. So the sad thing is that you might, if you're a PhD student or an early career researcher, you might say, I'll write a paper, I'll just draw a graph. And as long as it's kind of a Gaussian distribution, it looks reasonable, it looks like a paper, it smells like a paper, it tastes like a paper, so it must be a paper. Right? So publish it. It might be rubbish, and nobody's checking. Especially in computer science, there is anything attempt to reproduce. At least in the biomedical sciences, there is some attempt. And they're catching from every other day. So I would really like to see a time where these attempts are done in computer sciences.
So in many cases they are asking you to produce proof either visually, for example, it's graphics where they say show the picture, show the data set.
Yes, so some conferences and so on, journals are saying provide a link to the data set. But that's just to scare you. Not a lot of people actually, who will have the resources to re-implement the experiment just to catch somebody. At least in the biomedical sciences, people's lives are at stake, so there is some knowledge. Here they're claiming that some algorithm outperforms another algorithm. Maybe you're fudging your data. It's sad. So for the remaining lectures, just a slide that says, if you don't know these things very well, just quickly brush these up. Because these are the kinds of, if there's maths involved, this is the kind of maths that I make reference to. So, concept theory, logic and graph theory. So, if you know these things, you're fine for the remaining lectures. So, I think I've answered you enough for today. So, this is the end of the first lecture. We'll see you all on Monday. Okay, thank you.